This is the web transmission service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. On October the 27th, writer and RCMI member Derwin Mak delivered his annual Halloween talk, Count Dracula, His Life and Times.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to RCMI annual Halloween presentation, October 26, 2022. My name is Patricia Hines-White, and I organized this event, and it will be videotaped for educational purposes and available on RCMI YouTube. There will be a question and answer period following Derwin's presentation, and ask that you mute your mics until that time. Our guest speaker this evening is RCMI member Derwin Mak, and his topic, Count Dracula, His Life and Times. Derwin is a member of RCMI Library Committee and also an officer of St. John Ambulance and Order of St. John. A chartered accountant with a Master of Accounting degree from the University of Waterloo, he is retired from the provincial government where he worked in various capacities from accounting to fraud control. Derwin is also a science fiction writer and anthology writer. He has won 2 Aurora Awards, Canada's National Award for Science Fiction Writing, and the Alberta Book Publishing Award, and 5 years ago had the dubious honor of being the first and only person to capture a Pokemon inside RCMI. Derwin's first Halloween presentation in 2006 was Salem City of Witches, of which he gave an updated version in 2018. That was Salem City of Witches. And with that, a warm welcome. I'm virtually speaking. Derwin, the floor's yours.
Right, thank you, Pat. And 15 years ago, I gave a presentation at RCMI about the life and military campaigns of the Romanian prince Vlad Tepes, also known as Vlad Dracula or Vlad the Impaler. This presentation is going to be different. This one is going to be more about Bram Stoker and his most famous creation, the novel and character Dracula. But there will be some content about Vlad Tepes, not as much as my previous presentation. So if you're a fan of gory and violent military history, there's stuff for you here. Right, so let's talk about Dracula. Right, he's one of the most famous fictional characters in the world, and he's 125 years old this year. Right, so this is the 125th anniversary of the publication of the novel Dracula. And there's the British actor Christopher Lee as Dracula. Okay. Dracula was created by Bram Stoker, who usually went by his shortened form of his first name, Bram. And Bram Stoker was born in the district of Clontarf in Dublin in 1847. He had a very sickly childhood, though. Almost from the time he was born, he was afflicted with a mystery illness, which left him weak, often unable to walk, and confined to bed until age 7. Under the medical science of the day, doctors attempted bloodletting, right? And they bled him as an attempted cure, but that didn't work, right? Now, because he spent most of his time in bed, his mother would read to him, and he learned a lot of Irish legends, especially those about ghosts and the supernatural, from his mother in early childhood. Then, after he was 7 years old, he suddenly got cured of this mystery illness, which to this day, no one knows what it was. And when he was 17 years old, he went to Trinity College in Dublin. Right? There he studied history, literature, mathematics, and physics. He also became a star athlete, playing football, rugby, weightlifting, shot put, high and long jumping, and race walking. Now, this was actually nothing short of miraculous for someone who had spent half his childhood, unable to participate in any physical sports and being bedridden. It was just incredible that someone with such a childhood could become a star athlete of his university. He also served as president of the Philosophical Society and of the History Society. Bram Stoker was born into a middle-class, well-to-do Protestant Irish family, and his father had a well-paying job in the civil service. So he followed in his father's footsteps and became a civil servant and got the job of Inspector of Courts and Petty Sessions in 1870. This meant that he traveled around Ireland and inspected the courthouses to make sure that they were being run properly. He worked out of an office in Dublin Castle, which was the castle where the Governor General of Ireland worked out of. It was the seat of government in Ireland and a symbol to a lot of people. When I visited Dublin Castle, the tour guides always reminded me that it was a symbol of the British oppression of the Irish, right? But that's where he worked. Okay. Stoker found the civil service career quite boring. He didn't really like his job, but he kept it because it was a good, steady paycheck. So he went back to Trinity College as a part-time student to study math, right, while keeping his day job in the civil service. And he also entered the debating society, right? So although he had already graduated, he still went back to participate in the student associations. And in the debating society, he met Oscar Wilde, right, who's a famous Irish author. Right? I'm sure you've all heard of him. And the photograph is the long room of the library of Trinity College, which I visited in 2019. If you ever get to Dublin, make sure you visit this library. It is one of the most splendid historical places I've seen. It also doubles as a museum. Now, what's not well known to a lot of people who've heard about all the scandals involving Oscar Wilde was that he dated girls when he was in Ireland. Right? We all know of Oscar Wilde getting involved in a gay sex scandal when he was in England, but when he was in Ireland, he dated girls. Well, maybe he dated guys too, but he was more well known on campus for dating girls. And he had a girlfriend named Florence Balkans. But Bram Stoker stole Oscar Wilde's girlfriend. And Bram and Florence got married in 1878. At that same time, Oscar Wilde was rumored to be heartbroken that Florence had left him, left Ireland and went to England. Bram Stoker was interested in the arts and entertainment. It was certainly, to him, it was more exciting than working for the civil service. So he began writing reviews for the Dublin Evening Mail, one of the largest evening newspapers in Ireland at the time. And he wasn't paid for these reviews, so he became their unpaid drama critic. He didn't do it for the money. He did it because of his love of the arts and entertainment. The Dublin Evening Mail has some interesting literary connections, right? It's where the stories by James Joyce would be published, and some of these stories would be collected together as the Dubliners. The Dublin Evening Mail also had a rather interesting co-owner. Sharon LaFanu was one of its owners, and he would later become famous for writing Carmilla, a vampire lesbian story that became very popular with Victorian British. Also living in the UK around this time was Henry Irving, the most famous actor of his time. Henry Irving promoted the idea that theater is a serious art form and that acting is a respectable occupation. I know today we tend to view actors as celebrities, and they get awards, and we idolize them, and Prince Rainier of Monaco married a Hollywood star, Grace Kelly. But back then, up until the late 19th century, actors, although they may have provided entertainment, were just above prostitutes and other lowlife on the social ladder. They weren't very well respected until the late 19th century. Right? But Henry Irving was one of the actors who changed society's views on actors and their profession. Queen Victoria was a fan of Henry Irving, and thus Henry Irving became the first person to be knighted for services to theater in 1895. Henry Irving was also what the Victorians called an actor-manager. Not only did he act in plays, but he also took responsibility for the entire production. He was in charge of sets, lighting, direction, casting, and all the other aspects of putting on a play. He was so well regarded in his time that he's one of 7 actors buried in Westminster Abbey. When Henry Irving came to Dublin, Stoker wrote a review of his performance as Hamlet, and it was a very positive, complimentary, glowing review. On another one of Henry Irving's trips to Dublin, someone showed him a copy of Stoker's review, and Irving asked to meet Stoker, and they met, and the two became friends immediately. Or should I say they became frenemies? They were definitely close friends. When Henry Irving came to Dublin, he stayed with Bram and Florence, and when the Stokers went to London, they stayed with Henry Irving. And they were always, whenever they met, they were inseparable, but they also had very heated arguments and disagreements and feuded frequently. And hence that's why I'm using the modern term frenemies to describe them. Some people say they had a love-hate relationship. Around 1878, Henry Irving bought the Lyceum Theatre in London, one of the more prestigious and famous theaters of the city. There it is, the Lyceum Theatre. It's still standing today, and I think it's still playing The Lion King years later. Right? He needed a manager to run the theatre, so he asked Stoker if he would move from Dublin to Ireland, from Dublin to London to manage the theatre. Stoker wasted no time in quitting his civil service job and moving himself from Florence to London. So with his new job as manager of the Lyceum Theatre, Stoker met many of the arts and entertainment celebrities of the late 19th century. He met Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, Charles Dickens, W.B. Yeats, George Moore, Sir Richard Burton, the famous explorer who sneaked into Mecca by disguising himself as a Muslim. He met Alfred Lord Tennyson. And when Henry Irving toured the United States, he and Stoker met Mark Twain. So he met all these famous people of the 19th century. Stoker, however, wasn't satisfied with just meeting celebrities and getting to know them at the Lyceum Theatre. He wanted to make his own contribution to the arts as well. So he chose a literary career. And these are some of the novels he wrote: The Primrose Path, The Chain of Destiny, The Snake's Pass, The Fate of Fenella, The Waters Moo, and The Shoulder of Shasta. Right? That last one, The Shoulder of Shasta, is a Western novel. I mean, a cowboy story. Believe it or not, Bram Stoker, who did not live in the United States, but did have one trip into the US to meet and met Mark Twain, wrote a cowboy story. You probably don't remember these novels, and nobody else does either. Stoker wasn't what you'd call a very popular novelist during his lifetime. However, he did write one novel that everyone remembers now. Stoker, like a lot of other authors, was looking for opportunities to get his works published, and also wanted to write stuff that would be popular with the reading public of the day. And he noticed that there was a Gothic horror trend in the 1880s and 1890s. It's not the first Gothic horror trend ever, but there was a Gothic horror trend going on at that time. And here are some of the popular novels of that period: Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson, The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde, Florence's ex-boyfriend, The Island of Dr. Moreau by H.G. Wells, and The Beetle by Richard Marsh. Okay, the first three you've probably heard about. That fourth one, The Beetle, no one remembers today, but it was a bestseller back then. Stoker also noticed that vampires were trendy again. Vampires became very trendy in the 1840s when Vardy the Vampire appeared. Vardy the Vampire was a Penny Dreadful novel. A Penny Dreadful was a magazine that sold for 1 penny per issue, right? Hence the term Penny Dreadful. And Penny Dreadfuls had a chapter of a novel in each issue. So you bought a Penny Dreadful magazine 1 week, read a chapter of a novel, then bought the next issue the next week and read the next chapter of the novel. And Vardy the Vampire was this long serialized novel that ran for many issues. And it was incredibly popular, about this vampire nobleman called Count Dracula, who caused a lot of trouble in England. So that was Lord Ruthven, right? Also popular at this time was the novella Carmilla by Sheridan Le Fanu, one of the owners of the Dublin Evening Mail. Right? And it was a story about this beautiful lesbian vampire who preyed on other beautiful women. And the Victorians, despite their prim and proper reputation, loved stories with a lot of lurid sex or symbolic sex in them. So, of course, a story about a beautiful lesbian vampire attacking beautiful girls became very popular in Victorian society. Stoker also used some of the fears and anxieties of British society at the time in his fiction. And one of the great fears in British society at that time was the fear of immigrants and what the British called reverse colonization. In the late 19th century, Britain was discovering what a lot of previous empires, like the Romans, had discovered, that if you go and conquer a lot of foreign countries and tell the conquered peoples that your society is superior, it's got the superior educational system, it's got the superior arts and entertainment, it's got superior laws and education, and you educate these people to think of themselves as being subjects and people of a great empire, they will start wanting to go to the mother country and seeing for themselves what this great legal system and educational system and arts and culture are like, right? And it happened in Rome, it happened in the Ottoman Empire, it happens in every great empire, and it was beginning to happen in Britain in the late 19th century. People from the empire were starting to trickle in, not to the extent that they would after World War II, but to the British, even that small trickle in the late 19th century was a great flood. Right? And so Sir John Cologne, Member of Parliament for Bow and Bromley, said in 1888, England was being made a human ash pit for the refuse population of the world. Right? But it wasn't just people from the rest of the British Empire that were starting to frighten the British. Britain was also getting immigrants from Eastern Europe, and especially Jewish immigrants, and that worried the British too. So in January 1888, the Morning Post wrote that no one can doubt that there is a very serious side to this wholesale immigration of poor Russian Jews. It may be a source of positive danger and demoralization to a large section of our working population. Right? So if you read the newspapers and popular fiction of the time, a lot of British were afraid of Eastern Europeans and Jews and Italians and the Irish. The Irish, their treatment of the Irish is especially interesting because at that time, all of Ireland was part of the United Kingdom. So the Irish were technically not foreigners or immigrants, yet the people of the island of Great Britain treated most Irish as being foreigners. Although there was one subset of them which they treated as their own, and we'll get onto that. So here's an interesting question. Was Bram Stoker, an Irishman, subject to racism in England? And the answer is no, because Bram Stoker was the right type of Irishman. He was a Protestant Irishman, and Protestants were completely socially acceptable in Britain, being, the island that has England, Wales, and Scotland, and right. So he was completely acceptable there. The British saved their disdain for the Catholic Irish. Now, how did Bram Stoker identify himself? Because if you ask horror fiction fans or literary historians or members of the general public who know him, some people will say that Bram Stoker was an Irish author, and other people say he was a British author, and some people will say he was both. Well, Bram Stoker identified as both Irish and British. At that time, especially if you were Protestant, the two were not mutually exclusive, right? Protestant Irish identified as British as well. Right? So it's correct to say that he's both Irish and British. This raises another question. Is Dracula an Irish novel or is it a British novel? A lot of people regard it as being a British novel, but it was written by an Irishman, so some people say it's an Irish novel. My opinion is that Dracula is really a British novel. None of the characters are Irish. Most of the novel takes place in Britain. None of it takes place in Ireland. And a lot of the novel reflects the fears and anxieties and social mores of the British public of the time, not the Irish, and certainly not the Catholic Irish. So there you see that Bram Stoker's sense of identity is a lot more complex than it would be for, say, another author like James Joyce, who's definitely Irish and identified as Irish. Okay. Victorians also liked reading about their violent times, right? Forget those TV shows and movies like Mary Poppins that show Victorian England as being a very peaceful, fun-loving society. There was actually a lot of violence and sex going on then. Victorian Britain had this big underground pornography publishing business going on, right? It's not well known, but they did, despite their prim, proper, and chaste reputation. They also had a lot of magazines and newspapers that reported on violent crime. The Victorian public just loved reading about violence in their society. This is the Illustrated Police News, one of several newspapers in London that catered to readers who liked reading about violent crime. And as the headlines show, Jack the Ripper was one of the most popular news stories of the time. In 1890, Bram Stoker went on vacation to a town called Whitby, and there he found a public library on a street called Coffee House Quay. And in that public library, he found this book, an account of the principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia, written by William Wilkinson, the British consul to Bucharest, Wallachia, in 1818. Well, Wallachia and Moldavia are two of the principalities that would eventually unite and become modern Romania. While he was reading this book, he read about a Romanian or Wallachian prince named Vlad Tepes. While in Whitby, he also visited Whitby Abbey, which was a ruin. And he became so fascinated by Whitby Abbey that when he wrote his next novel, he created a fictional abbey based on Whitby. While at Whitby, he also heard of the wreck of the Dmitri. The Dmitri was a Russian ship that ran aground at Whitby, and it was carrying a cargo of silver sand, which is used for construction work. And this was, a major news item in Whitby in the late 1880s. Okay, so, and Stoker, was inspired by these events and things he saw and read about in Whitby, and he began writing his own Gothic horror novel. And that became Dracula, which was published on May 26, 1897 by Archibald Constable and Company, Westminster, London. So I'm sure you've all seen movies and TV shows and comic books and cartoons with Dracula in them, but maybe you haven't read the original novel, so I'll give you the plot in brief. Right? So Dracula starts with a Romanian nobleman named Dracula, who buys Carfax Abbey, a ruined abbey in London. Then he transports himself in several coffins filled with Romanian soil by ship to England. The ship is called the Demeter. The Demeter arrives in Whitby with its crew all missing, but a large dog jumps from the ship and onto the land. Of course, we all figure out that that dog is Dracula. Dracula settles down in Whitby and starts attacking people. Mina and Lucy, two very prim and proper English ladies, are on vacation in Whitby when Lucy falls ill and is bedridden, but she also sleepwalks. A visiting vampire hunter named Professor Abraham Van Helsing thinks Lucy has been attacked by a vampire. Lucy dies but turns into a vampire. Then Dracula moves to Carfax Abbey in London and begins attacking people there. Okay. So in the plot of Dracula, you can see various influence of Stoker's life and times on his fictional vampire story. First, let's look at Stoker's life. His mysterious illness that he had when he was a child, that becomes Lucy's mysterious illness, right? The bleeding and bloodletting that was done to him in an attempt to cure him of the illness, that became the blood sucking and blood loss in Dracula, right? You can also see the influence of the supernatural tales told by his mother, right? Whitby Abbey became the fictional Carfax Abbey in Dracula. And the ship Dmitri, carrying its load of cargo of Russian soil, that became the Demeter with its coffins filled with Romanian soil in Dracula. Also, let's look at the influence of Stoker's times on his writing. There was a lot of xenophobia and racism against Eastern Europeans, and that becomes the Romanian Count going to England to do great harm to the British, right? You can also see the influence of one of the big news stories of the day, the serial killer, Jack the Ripper. And the Victorians realized that all these scenes of this count, attacking women and sucking their blood, and an early scene of the novel where a British real estate agent in Romania is lying in bed, half asleep, and three gorgeous women come to the bed and start trying to attack him. The Victorians realized that was all symbolism for sex. So a lot of the Victorians' repressed sexuality made its way into this novel. Now, here's a question that literary historians have been asking for 125 years. Who inspired the character of Dracula, the king of the vampires? Some people say it was the actor Henry Irving. Henry Irving has several similarities to Count Dracula. He dressed very well, like he was a nobleman. He was arrogant. He liked to brag about himself. He was definitely a larger-than-life character who dominated every conversation he got into. When he entered a room, everybody noticed him, right? So a lot of people think that Henry Irving's real-life personality influenced the depiction of this great vampire in Dracula. But other people think that the Dracula character was based on the Wallachian or Romanian prince, Vlad Tepes. So let's look at the life of Vlad Tepes. This is the land of Dracula, right? So there's Wallachia over there, and there's a neighboring Moldavia and Transylvania, right? These three principalities would unite along with other territories to become modern Romania. There's Hungary over there and Bulgaria to the south, and the Ottoman Empire is around here too, right? And Vlad Tepes, or Vlad III, was the son of Vlad II, Prince of Wallachia, who had two reigns. Like a lot of Wallachian princes of the time, he reigned and got overthrown then recaptured his throne. And then several Wallachian princes, including his son, would have several reigns interrupted by periods of being overthrown by rivals. And Vlad II belonged to the Bessarab family, and he fought against his half-brother, Prince Alexandru Audia, for the throne. Vlad II allied himself with Sigismund, King of Hungary, and later Holy Roman Emperor. King Sigismund of Hungary had an order of knighthood called the Order of the Dragon, right? And he admitted or inducted Vlad II into the Order of the Dragon on February 8th, 1431 in Nuremberg. Now, in Romanian and other languages of that area, the word for dragon is Dracu, right? So Vlad II got a nickname, Vlad Dracula, because he was a member of the Order of the Dragon. If you add an A to the end of Dracula, you get the word Dracula, which means son of the dragon. And so hence his son, Vlad III, got the nickname Vlad Dracula. But depending on how you use the word Dracula and its context and how you use it, it could have an evil other meaning. It meant dragon, but it could also mean the devil. So hence, Dracula could also mean son of the devil. Vlad III eventually came to the throne, and like his father, had several reigns that were interrupted by periods of being overthrown. It was during his second reign, from 1456 to 1462, that he acquired the nickname Vlad Tepes. So Tepes means impaler, so Vlad Tepes means Vlad the Impaler. He got this nickname because he liked to execute people by driving large wooden stakes through their bodies and then planting the stakes in the ground so that these people would be skewered, and horrified observers can then come and watch these people die as they were impaled or skewered on these large wooden stakes. And here's a German illustration showing Vlad Tepes having dinner while his victims are dying of being skewered on large wooden stakes. And here in the lower left corner is a butcher hacking up human body parts to feed to Vlad for his dinner. Here are some of his victims. Vlad Tepes especially disliked the Saxons and other German ethnic minorities in his principality, so he would often round them up and kill them. He also disliked criminals, and he killed them. He really didn't like beggars, he killed them. He really hated the Turks, and he killed them. And he had a complicated relationship with monks and clergy. Those who agreed with him all the time, he rewarded with money so they could build monasteries, right? But those who disagreed with him, he impaled them, right? Some people see he was not a racist because he killed people from all ethnic groups. Although he especially disliked Muslims, he also killed a lot of Christians too. And he had this especially vile habit of torturing women before he killed them. Vlad Tepes also turned impalement into an art. Most dictators of the time simply killed their victims and really didn't care about what to do with the bodies afterwards. But Vlad would arrange the stakes in geometric patterns such as concentric circles. Because he killed so many Germans, he became very unpopular in Germany. And the Germans published a lot of books and pamphlets about him with their new media, new communications media, the printing press, which Gutenberg had recently invented, right? And so this is a quote from a German book about Vlad Tepes from the 15th century. The shocking story of a monster and berserker called Dracula, who committed such unchristian deeds as killing men by placing them on stakes, hacking them to pieces like cabbage, boiling mothers and children alive, and compelling men to acts of cannibalism. Okay. So let's look at some of the stories about Vlad Tepes. He just did not like the number of beggars in his principality. So he invited all of them to a big banquet. And as they were eating the free food, he had his men lock all the doors and seal all the windows in the building and set the building on fire. Nobody escaped from the building, and that's how he solved the problem of beggars in the streets. Then there were the Ottoman ambassadors who came to visit them, and they refused to take off their hats and turbans. When he asked why did they not take off their hats and turbans in the presence of a prince, they replied that as Muslims and Ottomans, they felt they had to keep their hats and turbans on. So he said that he appreciated their piety and their religiosity, and he promised to help them, practice their religion. So he ordered his men to nail the turbans and hats into the heads of the ambassadors. Then there was the gold cup at the fountain. In his capital city, there was a public fountain, and anyone could use a tin cup at the fountain and get a drink of water. But the tin cup was always getting stolen. So Vlad replaced the tin cup with a gold cup. And he passed a law saying that anyone found in possession of the gold cup away from the fountain would get the death penalty. Nobody ever stole the gold cup. As I mentioned, he was both a killer of clergy and a patron of churches. Clergy whom he liked were rewarded very well, and he gave them the money to build the Govara Monastery and the Snagov Monastery. In 1459, Pope Pius II declared a crusade against the Ottoman Turks at the Council of Mantua, and only one European ruler joined the crusade immediately. That was Vlad Tepes. Well, that had made him very popular with the papacy in the Italian city-states. So the Italian city-states, including Venice and the papal states, threw money at him for his crusade against the Turks. And in 1461, he went to war against the Turks, who were ruled by Mehmet II, the Ottoman Sultan. And Vlad Tepes invaded Bulgaria. He was a pioneer of biological warfare. He sent diseased peasants to befriend and infect the Turks. He also won a battle against the Turks. This battle was the famous night attack at Targovishte. Right? The Wallachians were outnumbered 3-1. There were 30,000 Wallachians going up against 90,000 Turks, but he attacked their camp by surprise at night, and he won the battle. The Wallachians suffered 5,000 casualties, whereas the Turks suffered 15,000 casualties. Mehmet II decided that he had to do something, so he led an army against Vlad Tepes. But as his army was marching to engage Vlad and the Wallachians, he discovered 20,000 impaled Turks and Muslim Bulgarians, men, women, and children, all impaled and dead or dying on these wooden stakes. The sight of so many people so ruthlessly killed by Vlad Tepes demoralized and frightened Turks, and they retreated back to Constantinople. After Vlad Tepes died, he had a very honored reputation in the rest of Europe, believe it or not. I mean, today we think of him as being a brutal dictator, and he was, but to the European rulers of the time, he was a hero, right? In Italy, the Italian rulers, including the Pope, considered him a heroic crusader for Christianity and a political ally of the Italian states in Rome. And he may have been an influence on the Italian political philosopher Niccolo Machiavelli. I'm sure you've heard of him. Right? He was also a role model for the Tsars of Russia. In 1482, Fedor Kuritsyn wrote the book, The Story of the Romanian Prince Dracula, for the Grand Duke of Moscow, Ivan the Terrible, soon to become Tsar of Russia. Right? And the Russian rulers and other Russians wrote books praising Vlad Dracula as a strong leader and role model for kings. However, they thought he had committed, the Russians thought he had committed an unpardonable, inexcusable sin. And that sin wasn't, mass murder or the killing of people without trial or torturing innocent people. No, that sin was that Vlad Tepes had at one point converted to Roman Catholicism. There was a period when Vlad Tepes was imprisoned and held hostage by King Matthias Corvinus of Hungary. And to get out of prison, Vlad Tepes converted from the Orthodox faith to Roman Catholicism so he could marry a relative of King Matthias. To the Russian rulers, that was an unforgivable sin against God. Vlad Tepes was and still remains a national hero in Romania. Nicolae Ceausescu, another dictator, was an admirer of Vlad Tepes. Ceausescu was killed by his own army at Târgoviște, which was also the site of Vlad Tepes's night attack on the Ottoman Turks. In 2006, the Romanian TV audience voted Vlad Dracula as being the 12th greatest Romanian in history on the TV show Mari Romani. The Germans, however, had a very different impression of Vlad Tepes. They condemned him as a mass murderer and killing of innocents. And during this time and after his death, there were many anti-Dracula books and pamphlets published in Germany. And these were among the first bestsellers after the Gutenberg Bible. So back to the question, did Stoker really model Dracula on Vlad Tepes? That idea seems to have started in 1958 with Professor Basil Kirtley at the University of Hawaii. And this theory got a lot of popularity in the 1970s when two horror fiction scholars, Raymond McNally and Radu Florescu, wrote In Search of Dracula in 1972. But the late Professor Elizabeth Miller, who was a Canadian who studied the Dracula novel extensively, said no. In her opinion, other than the name, Stoker did not base Dracula on Vlad Tepes. You got the name from Vlad Tepes, but nothing else about the character is based on Vlad Tepes. And after reading the novel, I agree with Elizabeth Miller. Nothing in the novel mentions that Dracula, the fictional vampire, was a prince in the past, except for one paragraph in chapter 21. And that's when he's insulting his English enemies by saying that he had outwitted his enemies in past centuries, by saying that whilst they played wits against me who commanded nations and intrigued for them and fought for them hundreds of years before they were born, I was countermining them. Right? That's the only mention you get that the vampire who bought real estate in London was in any way possibly a prince in the previous century. Was Dracula a bestseller when it came out? No. Actually, sales were quite modest. And the best-selling Gothic novel of 1897 was The Beetle by Richard Marsh. Right? And The Beetle is about an Egyptian or Arab who comes to Britain and does a lot of harm to British society. Right? It's another story with an evil foreigner coming to Britain. In 1905, Henry Irving died, and Bram Stoker wrote Personal Reminiscences of Henry Irving. Right? This book does not mention any of the feuds or disagreements or arguments that he had with Henry Irving. It's very complimentary and glowing, and very much a book that praises Henry Irving. Right? But after Henry Irving's death, Stoker's final years were not a happy one. He wound up in financial difficulties because he no longer had that job at the Lyceum Theater, and he and Florence had to depend on handouts from their families to, get some income. Right? He also suffered some poor health and strokes, and he died on April 20th, 1912. Right? 12 years after he died, Hamilton Dean, an actor, asked Florence if he could write a play based on Dracula. And she let him gave him the permission to write this play. So Hamilton Dean wrote the play based on Dracula. Now there's some interesting connections between Hamilton Dean, Bram Stoker, and Henry Irving. Dean's family owned the property next to the one owned by Stoker's father in Dublin. Dean was also an actor in Henry Irving's company. And after Henry Irving died, he founded his own acting company, the Hamilton Dean Company. So Hamilton Dean wrote this Dracula play, and he played Dr. Abraham Van Helsing, and Edmund Blake played Dracula. And they premiered this play at the Grand Theatre in Derby in 1924, and it became very popular in Britain. It became so popular that Americans wanted to see it. So in 1927, Hamilton Dean took the play to Broadway, and they also had a US tour. And on Broadway and in the United States, Edward Van Sloan played Dr. Van Helsing, and a new Hungarian American actor named Bela Lugosi played Dracula. Right? Lugosi was originally from Hungary, but he escaped to the United States during a failed revolution there. And Dracula became a very popular play and made Lugosi into a Broadway star. A few years later, in 1930, Universal Pictures, or Universal Studios, made a movie based on Frankenstein. And it was so popular that Universal wanted to make another horror movie. And Universal noticed that Dracula was very popular in Broadway, so Universal bought the rights to make a movie version of the Dracula play. And Universal hired Edward Sloan and Bela Lugosi to star in that movie as well. And that made Lugosi into a movie star. Now, it's true Lugosi did have a terrible career, in the 1940s and 50s, but that's a story for another time. But it was this Dracula movie that made Lugosi famous beyond Broadway. You've no doubt seen Dracula everywhere, from movies, comics, TV shows, even your breakfast cereal, which raises the question, who owns Dracula? Right? And there's Hotel Transylvania, right, on Teletoon. Well, Dracula is in the public domain right now, but it was the subject of a famous copyright dispute. When Bram Stoker wrote and published Dracula, the UK, Germany, and other countries were signatories to the Berne Convention for the Protection of Literary and Artistic Works, which was first signed in 1886. Now, what the Berne Convention means that if your artistic work is copyrighted in one country that belongs to the Berne Convention, it's automatically copyrighted in all the other countries that belong to the Berne Convention. So the Dracula was immediately copyrighted in the UK, Germany, and all these other countries of the Berne Convention when it was published. But there was one notable exception to the Berne Convention for 100 years, and that's the United States, right? The United States did not join the Berne Convention until 1989. So all the books and plays and that were written and all the movies that were made in all these other countries had to register their own copyrights in the United States at the Copyright Office at the Library of Congress. This situation, this problem finally ended in 1989 when the United States joined the Berne Convention. Now, during World War I, there was a German soldier named Albin Grau who was interested in spooky and supernatural things. And when he was stationed in Serbia, he met a Serbian farmer who claimed that his father was a vampire and one of the undead. And after the war, Albin Grau wanted to make a horror movie. So he formed his own movie company and hired F.W. Murnau, a German film director, to direct the movie. He wanted to base the movie on Dracula, but Florence did not want to sell the movie rights to Albin Grau. I don't know the reason. Maybe it had something to do with some resentment against the Germans after World War I. But for whatever reason, Florence did not want to sell the movie rights to Albin Grau. So Grau decided to just make his own Dracula movie without getting the copyright. And he did some things like change the names of the characters, like changing Count Dracula to Count Orlok, right? there's Max Schreck, the actor, playing Count Orlok. But Florence saw through these cosmetic changes and successfully sued Albin Grau for making an unauthorized version of Dracula. And as part of the settlement of the lawsuit, Albin Grau had to destroy all the prints of Nosferatu. But one print survived, and that print was in the United States, because the United States was not a signatory to the Berne Convention, and therefore Dracula was not copyrighted there. As it turns out, Bram Stoker, for whatever reason, had neglected to register the copyright for Dracula in the United States. So for decades, Dracula was not subject to copyright protection in the United States. In fact, today, it still isn't. So all the prints of Nosferatu that you see on TV and in movie theaters and on DVD and on YouTube are descended, that is, copies made from this one print that survived in the United States. Under the Berne Convention at the time, a copyright lasts for the lifetime of the author and 50 years afterwards. Nowadays it's 70 years, but back then it was 50 years. And so the copyright on Dracula expired in 1962, 50 years after Stoker died. From before then, two companies made approved Dracula movies. They were Universal Studios in the United States and Hammer Pictures in Britain. Right? There's Christopher Lee as Dracula in a Hammer movie. In 1962, the copyright expired, and everybody began making their own Dracula movies. Here's one of them, Billy the Kid versus Dracula, from Joseph E. Levine, the same producer who gave us Jesse James Meets Frankenstein's Daughter. Right? Obviously, some of these were classics. And anyone can write a Dracula novel these days. The one on the left is Sherlock Holmes versus Dracula. It is a rather complicated or interesting legal history. The author, Lauren D. Estelman, did not need to get anyone's permission to use Dracula as a character. But when he wrote the novel, Sherlock Holmes was still under copyright, so he had to get permission from the estate of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle to use Sherlock Holmes and the other characters from the Holmes stories. And on the right is Dracula in Love by Karen Essex. Yes, a romance novel about Dracula and one of his girlfriends. There is a Bram Stoker estate, and there are three people running the estate. Dacre Stoker, great-grandnephew of Bram Stoker, so a descendant of one of Stoker's brothers. Jeanette Stoker, Dacre's wife, and Robin Guy McCall, the great-grandson of Bram Stoker. This is from their website. The Bram Stoker estate does not claim to own the copyright for Dracula because Dracula is in public domain now, and it doesn't ask that people pay them any royalties if anyone wants to make a Dracula movie. The Bram Stoker estate is much more concerned with preserving historical information and the papers and documents related to Bram Stoker. Right? So it serves that function. It also promotes certain, what they call authorized sequels to Dracula. Dacre Stoker teamed up with other horror writers to write a prequel to Dracula and also a sequel novel to Dracula. And because Dacre Stoker belongs to the Stoker family, publishers have billed these as being the approved or authorized sequels to Dracula. So I hope you've enjoyed my presentation and how Dracula was created by Bram Stoker and how the character has become a character of Gothic fiction and has gone into all forms of entertainment and media and has even become a character of children's humor. On the right is Count Frightenstein, 13th son of Count Dracula, from the TV show Hilarious House of Frankenstein, which was made in Hamilton, Ontario. Some of you may remember watching that show on Channel 11. And here's my own connection to the Dracula legend. There I am, meeting Carolyn Munro, the actress who There she is on the right too, as she appeared in the movie Dracula, AD 1972. She played one of Dracula's victims in that movie. And I guess on the right, she's wearing what a lot of women allegedly wore in London in 1972. I met Carolyn Monroe last month at Horrorama, a horror movie convention in Toronto. So that's my presentation, and I hope everyone has a happy Halloween this year.
When you mentioned that someone had written a Holmes Dracula novel in passing and had to seek consent of the Arthur Conan Doyle estate, but I mean there have been a lot of Holmes Dracula stories. There was Fred Saberhagen. Poul Anderson used to sneak him into his stories at regular intervals. Did they all have to go through that too?
I don't know about that. We'd have to check with someone who's more better versed on Sherlock Holmes than I am.
Doug Wigglesworth, where are you?
Yeah, is there a Sherlock? Is there a Sherlock? What do they call them? Sherlockians or Holmesians?
Sherlockians.
Sherlockians, yeah. So I'm going to check that because there have been numerous. I'm not a big expert on Sherlock Holmes, but I do know there's been numerous what they call pastiches over the decades, right? So now again, I don't know when or if the Holmes copyright has expired yet.
Yeah, I mean, it was Saberhagen that wrote the Holmes Dracula file and the other sequels, wasn't it?
Yes, he was there, right? And Holmes shows up in a bunch of other things too, right? Because the 1970s, they had Sherlock Holmes. I don't know how he got to Dallas in 1963, investigating the assassination of John F. Kennedy in one novel. Right?
Usually a plane ticket does it, but
yeah, that's right, a plane ticket from 1890 London, right? Yeah, but yeah, Holmes has appeared in a whole bunch of things, and but unfortunately, I'm no expert on Sherlock Holmes.
Yeah. Well, look, the Dallas thing may be explained if there was a blue phone box in that background, but
yeah, that would come in 1963, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Or any other period he wanted.
That's right. Yeah. Right. Well, there's no other questions.
How do we ask questions?
You just did.
Okay. What do you think the significance is of Stoker giving Van Helsing his first name?
Oh yeah, it's. I think a lot of people have mentioned that. I think Bram Stoker liked to imagine. I think it was a sort of a way of sort of Bram Stoker sort of playing around with being the hero of the story, right? Because Van Helsing, although sometimes it's too tempting to read. Sometimes we have to be careful about reading too much about the author's own personality in the characters, right? There are a few similarities between Dr. Van Helsing and Bram Stoker. Like both men liked staying in libraries and reading about them. Both men were university graduates, right? Both men like to think of themselves as being highly educated, right? But there's obviously other differences between the real life Bram Stoker and the fictional Van Helsing. Stoker obviously didn't run around driving stakes into vampires, right? And of course, as we know, both men were quite well versed in the legends and superstitions of the Balkan countries in Eastern Europe. So I think in a way, Van Helsing was sort of a proxy for Stoker himself in the novel.
Thank you.
I had a quick question. What's the connection between Frankenstein and Dracula?
Well, there actually is no connection other than they're both studied as English Gothic horror novels. I mean, Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein in the early 19th century. Bram Stoker wrote Dracula in the late 19th century. There's no literary connection and no historical connection between the two authors, but the connection occurs at Universal Studios, because Universal had bought the rights to make Dracula movies, and Universal had also made a Frankenstein movie. So inevitably, Universal came up with the idea of putting Frankenstein characters together with Dracula characters in movies like House of Frankenstein and House of Dracula, right? And Universal continues with that to this day. Almost 20 years ago in the early 2000s, they had a movie called Van Helsing, which reunited all their monsters from the 1930s and 40s together, right? So there's the connection, not through the authors, but through Universal Studios. All right, well, I guess if there's no other questions, so thank you all for zooming in tonight, and hope you have a nice Halloween.
No more questions? All right, well, thank you very much for a very well-researched presentation. And as I say, I usually present you with a token of appreciation from RCMI at this time. So virtually speaking, it's impossible. So please see RCMI Executive Assistant Susan Cook, and she's got one waiting for you. And now, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your participation. I now declare this meeting ended. Thank you all.
This has been another in our series of webcasts produced by the Royal Canadian Military Institute in Toronto as a public educational service. You can find news of upcoming events and links to our webcast archives at www.rcmi.org. On behalf of the RCMI, this is Eric Morse saying goodbye for now, and thank you for joining us.